Good afternoon, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member, and Honorable Subcommittee members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. My name, again, is Cheryl Andrews-Maltais, and I'm the Chairwoman of the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead Aquinnah. My tribe has lived on our Aboriginal homelands for since time immemorial, and we've occupied the island of Mnopi, what is also known as Martha's Vineyard, for over 13,000 years. We're part of the Great Wampanoag Nation, and we are the first people to meet the Pilgrims in 1620, and we were the original signatories to the first treaty in this hemisphere, the 1621 Treaty of Peace between us and King James I. Like other tribes in New England, we were the first to endure colonial laws which were written to limit and take away our inherent sovereignty, our rights, our culture, our lands, and our traditional way of life. But despite over 400 years of this attempted genocide and acculturation, we remain here, strong and resilient. I began with this brief history of my people as an example of the fact that most of our tribes have faced with other treaties with the United States. Before contact as indigenous peoples of these lands, all tribes maintained thriving communities, robust economies, with significant intertribal trade and commerce, political alliances, sophisticated indigenous knowledge through which we utilized, maintained, and managed and preserved our natural resources. Our rights to practice our way of life was given to us by the Creator as sovereign tribal nations, and we exercise those rights as individual governments and stewards of our land and our natural resources for ourselves and our future generations. The Indian policies that were initially established were devised to strip us of all that we knew and held dear. They were specifically designed to kill the Indian and eradicate us from existence, a systematic plan to divest us of all of our lands and natural resources, and a way to try to force us into submission and into a way of life foreign to us, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of us through wars, starvation, disease, and broken spirits. However, we are still here. We've survived, resistant, resilient, and strong. Through the centuries, we've also witnessed the failed policies of the United States as they've intended to try to help us as Native peoples. As documented in the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, A Quiet Crisis, and its follow-up report, Broken Promises, the United States has failed to meet its trust and treaty obligation and has failed to adequately fund tribes and federal agencies in order to meet its obligations to the tribes. However, a dynamic shift in the Indian policies came with the passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. This forward-thinking legislation was one of Congress's first efforts to meaningfully acknowledge tribal nations' sovereignty and recognize our ability to administer programs and services at a higher level of expertise and effectiveness than before. It empowered our tribal nations across the country to assert our sovereignty and determine our own destinies, which has had far better outcomes. This is the route that my tribe chose. Self-governance has provided a mechanism through which we've been able to better provide for our people. Self-governance has been transformative. This couldn't have been proven more clearly than with the accomplishments of so many tribes during the recent COVID pandemic. Tribes were provided direct federal funding with simple, specific guidance for the use of the funds. And like with self-governance, we demonstrated how well we can do our jobs when given the resources and the federal government steps out of the way. While some strides have been made, the government still seems to treat our sovereign nations as wards of the government with a paternalistic perspective. Federal funding across Indian country is often delivered through a competitive grant process or through states. Grant funding fails to reflect the unique nature of federal trust obligation and tribal sovereignty by treating tribal nations as nonprofits rather than governments, which is an abrogation of the federal trust responsibility. Advancing self-determination and self-governance is a must. The expansion of the ISDEA authorities would be the next evolutionary step for the federal government's recognition of tribal sovereignty and would reflect its full commitment to tribes. As previously noted, tribal nations, we are political, sovereign entities with the status that stems from our inherent sovereignty, and we as self-governance peoples predate the founding of the United States. We call upon Congress to enact legislation that expands self-governance capabilities across the federal government so that we may fully exercise our inherent sovereign rights to manage our affairs and resources. Thank you for your attention to this critical issue, and I stand ready to assist in any way to work together to strengthen tribal sovereignty and self-determination.
I thank the witness for her testimony. The chair now recognizes Mr. J. Spaan for 5 minutes.